It's February 1945, and the full might of the US war machine is raging its way across the Pacific, heading straight for the Japanese home islands. Hordes of B-29 bombers, accompanied by their P-51, F-6F, F-4U, and P-47 fighter escorts, are waging a campaign of fire and brimstone against both military and industrial targets on the ground. On the other side of the fence, depleting numbers of Japanese aircraft and experienced pilots slowly begin to take their toll as high-altitude intercepts begin to become commonplace. The likes of the J-2M Raiden, Ki-84 Frank, Ki-61 Heen, and the N-1K2 Shidenkai are sent up day after day, attempting to stop the onslaught of American might and firepower, to little success. Head-on passes become the main strategy for IJA pilots, and failing that, ramming the bombers isn't entirely out of the question. Yet back on the ground, aircraft manufacturer Kawasaki were busy running a test flight for a new, more powerful and efficient army fighter, the Ki-100. Development for a new aircraft had started back in October of '44, as the ever-troublesome HA-140 engine of the Ki Tony fighter was proving to be too unreliable, so the Japanese war effort was desperately in need of a change. Through modifying the airframe of three of the latest Tonys, the Ki-61 Mark II Kai, Chief Engineer Takeo Doi and his engineers proceeded to design a new plane that could fit the Mitsubishi 14-cylinder HA-112 engine. The 60 series was lighter, meaning that further improvements could be made to the aircraft's performance. For instance, the previously used lead counterweight in the tail was removed, given that it no longer had to balance out the heavier 140 engine. This also meant that other components like the heavier coolant radiator could also be removed too, further reducing the wing loading and improving the overall turn radius of the Ki-100. As testing of the aircraft continued into April and March of 1945, it was found to be superior to the Japanese Army's best fighter at that time, the Ki-84 Frank, in near enough every regard, be it in the hands of an experienced pilot. Designated as the Ki-100 Mark I Co. Army Fighter Type 5, this early version would continue to be converted from existing Ki-61 Mark II Kais and 61 Mark III airframes until May 1945, where 118 newly built Ki-100 Mark I Otsus were rolled out with an improved canopy and cut down rear fuselage. Used by the 5th, 17th, 18th, 20th, 59th, 111th, 112th, 200th, and perhaps most famously, the 244th Sentai, the Ki-100 would first see combat on the night of the 9th of March, 1945. Struggling engine performance at high altitude had constantly plagued the aircraft of the defenders, but it was the Ki-100 who would storm ahead in leading the charge against the B-29s. The HA-112 engine finally saw the Japanese catching up to their American adversaries as it allowed for direct fuel injection. The aircraft's armament remained the same as the Heen, with two cowl-mounted 20mm cannons and two 12.7mm wing-mounted machine guns. The solid firepower, matched with the 100's ability to dive with P-51 Mustangs while maintaining speed after a pullout, meant it was capable of outmaneuvering any Allied fighter at that time. Most famously, ace Heen pilot Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the 244th Sentai had gained a reputation in taking the fight to the Americans, having used his plane on multiple occasions to ram the bombers. His unit began flying the new Ki-100 in May, with further commendations and a promotion coming his way in the weeks that would follow. The 25th of July 1945 would see Major Kobayashi directly disobey orders after he and his men took off in their 100s to take on a group of US Navy F-6F Hellcats from Squadron 31 that were busy attacking Yokkaichi Airfield. Despite being told to stand down and wait for incoming bombers, the ace led his men into battle that would see dogfights taking place at almost hangar-top height, with both sides losing two planes each, one being from a mid-air collision that killed both pilots. His court-martial was dropped after word of his actions reached the ears of the Emperor, whose imperial approval halted any repercussions of the incident. Kobayashi would go on to survive the war, credited with 8 aerial victories, though some records put that number as high as 12. Despite the huge step forward in performance and minor successes in the air, the Ki-100 ultimately would not stop the raging tide of destruction US bombs were laying down on Japanese industry. The slow delivery of required components, plus the bombing of the plants at Ichinomiya and Kakamegahara, would cease production of the aircraft entirely. Of the 100 of Allied bombers and escorts dropping their payloads over Japanese soil, Imperial squadrons in August of 1945 were barely mustering sorties above 35 aircraft at best, and that's without factoring in planes that had to abort and turn back due to engine trouble. The odds were well and truly stacked, and as the Pacific War ended after Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, the Ki-100 would see its final flight on home soil, with 2 aircraft being flown as part of the handover to the US that were to be shipped back for evaluation. The remaining Japanese aircraft, regardless of type, across multiple airfields and bases across the country of Japan, were to be turned into scrap, with ground crews being ordered to disarm all planes before said aircraft was to be crushed and burnt in huge piles of scorched metal. Even though Japan had indeed surrendered, the Americans were still wary of Japanese suicide attempts, even during handover and evaluation flights. Former Japanese pilots were kept around in order to help display the true performance of their former aircraft to the occupiers, and were given very strict instructions to follow during testing. Despite not holding any armament while in the air, they were ordered not to exceed a certain altitude, speed, and most importantly, not to perform any acrobatic maneuvers, otherwise they would be shot down. The Shidenkai took off and was quickly followed by a pair of Corsairs. Although the Japanese fighter was unarmed, the Americans were still worried about a possible suicide dive into one of their ships. They watched Shiga cautiously. There was a thin whisper of white spray trailing the Shidenkai, an indication of a fuel leak. Shiga quickly landed his aircraft to the applause of marine onlookers. Necessary repairs were soon made, and Shiga took off again under the watchful guard of the F-4Us. Since this was his last flight, he decided to take liberties. He climbed to 500 meters, dived, and rolled his aircraft. A Corsair approached, and the American gestured for Shiga to take his aircraft down immediately, and he complied. When Shiga landed, he was politely told of his breach of regulations. "But you didn't say anything about a roll," responded Shiga. The Americans saw the humor in his response and told him that everything was fine. While the US held the mainland, the rest of Southeast Asia fell under the operation of the RAF, specifically within the Technical Air Intelligence Unit. The TAIU-SEA's job was to recover Japanese aircraft and gather data regarding their technical and tactical capabilities. Some 2,500 miles away from the home islands, on an airfield at Ton Son Nhut in Saigon, modern-day southern Vietnam, 24 Japanese aircraft were discovered in serviceable condition. One of these planes, a Ki-100 Mark I Otsu, would eventually become the very last of its kind. Ferried by Sergeant Kishi, he disclosed to Allied intelligence that he had delivered these aircraft shortly before Japanese surrender, with their intended purpose being a morale booster for the squadrons that were stationed there. By the 26th of November 1945, the aircraft was to be flown to a different airfield. However, upon attempted landing by Kyushu at said airfield, the undercarriage refused to deploy on approach, forcing an emergency landing back at Ton Son Nhut, which proceeded to damage the propeller, tail wheel, and oil cooler. Replacement parts were scavenged from other aircraft that were there at the time, including the propeller of a Ki-84 Frank and the oil cooler of a Ki-46 Dyna by Japanese ground crews, who then completed repairs a month later in December. Between late 1945 and June of 1946, the Otsu was shifted over to Malaya, along with 3 other aircraft, including the cockpit section of a Zero fighter, a Cyprus biplane, and once again a Ki-46 Dyna recon aircraft. All would be shipped back to the UK, arriving in Portsmouth by August of 1946. Now these aircraft would then spend the next 16 years or so being shifted around to various locations across the country, with the Ki-100 being misidentified as a Ki-43 Oscar for quite some years, before finally arriving at RAF Cosford in 1961. It would spend the next 40 years being bounced between Cosford and multiple shows, bases and museums across the UK, receiving engine maintenance and plenty of new paint jobs along the way, not to mention a visit from the aircraft's very own creator from all those years ago, Takeo Doi, at RAF St Athan in 1987. It wouldn't be until 2003 that this fighter would end up at RAF Hendon, today known as the Royal Air Force Museum, London. And here it is in person, the Ki-100 Mark I Otsu, the last remaining Japanese superfighter of World War II. As someone who gets more excited about seeing an authentic Japanese fighter plane than a Spitfire or a Hurricane, you can imagine the extent of my joy and somewhat surprise seeing this aircraft on British soil, but I'm nevertheless very happy to have it here and experience it up close. It was quite fitting that the 100 was positioned next to the Oka and the Ki-46, being that they both belonged and were delivered together. The Oka I have seen previously at other locations, mainly Cosford, but that was many years ago. But just being able to get close-up shots of the 100 was just a pure delight of the entire trip, and the main reason why I headed down there in the first place. But also seeing where the guns would have been, you would have had those two 20mm cannons in the fuselage, and then the wing-mounted 12.7mm on both sides, so it packed the firepower necessary. But my only gripe with this exhibition was just how it was all sort of overshadowed and squashed in next to this B-24 Liberator, which is beautiful. It's got that crimson chin, but the Japanese planes will kind of shoot off to the side. The exhibitions were being shifted around, so you may be able to notice that the information panel at the front noted that it was a Kitty Hawk, so you could tell that things were being moved around, but hopefully there will be more space in future to be able to get more of a 360 look at the 100, because that was my aim going down there, to get all the shots possible, but you can see that I can only really get things from the front, and it's kind of the same with the Ki-46 here as well. Considering the rarity of these planes, I think it would be really cool for them to have their own little section and space within the hangar in future exhibitions, hopefully. I know that's way easier said than done, given that the space is just filled to the brim with all kinds of planes, bombers, everything, you name it. If you want to see more of this sort of stuff, then do follow me over on Twitter, where I'll be posting all the pictures from the trip and all the planes that I've been seeing. You'll find the links to everything in the description, but yeah, absolutely loved it, would highly recommend it, and I will hopefully be going again in future when, again, I'll be able to hopefully get maybe a little bit more access to this aircraft and to showcase it more in even greater detail. Despite functioning as a superior aircraft in one-on-one fighter dogfights with Allied planes on paper, the truth of the matter was that the likes of the Ki-100 and N1K2 George were introduced too late into the war to ever make an impact. As Japan lost ground across the Pacific and fell back into the spiral of home defense against US bombing raids, the true might of these aircraft simply could not be tested against the likes of the B-29s. You have to ponder the idea as to whether the likes of the Ki-100 would have dominated the skies over Japanese-held territory if it were developed and rolled out much earlier in the war, especially as well if it were flown by the greater allotment of pilots that had already received their experience in the late 30s over China. Even so, this plane is deeply underrated, it is easily one of my favourites, and I highly recommend checking it out for yourself at the Royal Air Force Museum London, should you ever get the chance in future.